Hello, everybody. This is Jeremy Visser again. This is episode 3 of my basically YouTube channel regarding Age of Sigmar. I'm going to today talk about Galletian Champions. How many do you really need in a list? How to evaluate which Galletian Champions you should pick, and really, like, what is their overall impact to your strategy into winning games in the new GHB? For context, for once again, as a kind of a disclaimer, for if you don't know who I was the ex-captain of Team America in 2022. I'm still a current player, playing for 3 years for the team since basically AOS Worlds around. I'm also the current commissioner of AOS Worlds. I've won ITC 2019 of Fire Slayers, usually in the top 10 ranking, somewhere around that for the circuit. I'm not trying to basically, give myself a long nose here. I'm just trying to give some context that, like, hey, like, I'm somewhat, what do you consider as expert, I guess, if you can be an expert to this game. But for the most part, like, it is important for folks to know, like, if you're going to listen to me in my entire rambling on for 30-ish minutes about this today, that it's got he's coming from some voice of authority in the sense. Definitely not affiliated with Games Workshop in any way, so I guess it doesn't make me an authority. But either way or not, here am I rambling about why you should listen to me, even though really you should have no interest at all. Or you're just here to just enjoy the vibes, whatever. It's just, we're basically going to talk about the new GHB. All right, so the topic at hand today is once again Galletian Champions. What are they? They're, for those who don't really, we're fairly new to AOS, or we don't, we haven't really read the new GHB. Galletian Champions is the new mechanic in which they are replacing Galletian veterans from the previous GHB. And Galletian Champions are, your heroes, which are less than 10 wounds, and do not have a mount and nor companion, and also, well, not unique. Regarding the companion and mount thing, I think their Pro Games Workshop is most likely going to address that because there's a certain faction in the game right now which has access to 0 Galletian champions. Well, actually, two factions which have zero Galletian champions. That is Sons of Behemoth. They're giants, and then Deepkin. Deepkin do not have any Galletian champions because every one of their characters comes with a companion. And companions are counted as mounts, and then that's the limit of Galletian Champion. But I'm assuming they're going to errata that or fact it to just that companions don't count towards the limitation of Galletian Champion. Because there's a couple other heroes in the factions where it doesn't make sense. Like, I think the killer boss from Cruel Boys has like one of the little, like, goblin is counted as a companion, even though, so, like, it basically means he's not a Galletian champion. His companions count as mounts. Long story short, basically it's your foot heroes, less than 10 wounds. They don't have to be leaders in terms of battlefield role. They just have to be heroes, less than 10 wounds, no, and not a unique character. Cool. Very simple. What does that get you if you basically have this mechanic in your army? Or do you have these heroes in your army? Well, firstly, they open up access to various battle tactics and grand strategies, as well as heroic action. Let's talk a little bit about the grand strategies, because the heroic actions, while they are important, they don't necessarily what's the word I'm looking for? They don't necessarily enable you to win in the more traditional sense of linear scoring. They just enable you to win by basically decision making during the game, right? So what I mean by that is the heroic actions from the new Galletian champions allow them to fight in the hero phase, which is really cool. It lets you basically get another sequence of attack from one of your Galletian champions. There isn't a lot of Galletian champions out there which are effectively really powerful in the melee phase, or like something like you'd have to like really worry about in terms of the game and like what you're facing. But they also enabled this other battalion mechanic called the Galletian Command, which allows you to make a unit of sworn protectors come with this Galletian champion, and if you are in the bottom of the turn, you can technically activate that Galletian champion and the sworn protectors for 2 heroic actions in that turn, allowing that unit to basically strike and the hero phase, and that could actually be fairly impactful. Galletian champion swing in the hero phase is cool, nice. It's like little, it's a cool ability at the cost of a more traditional heroic action, but the swarm predictor combination with the battalion is pretty important. But going back to the original topic, like how do they help you win? One of the many ways they help you win is by if your book, your current battle tome, doesn't have very good grand strats. You have now the ability to take one of these GHB grand strats, and half of them are related around Galletian Champion mechanics. So the first three are kind of the older ones from the previous GHB, so I won't really cover them necessarily. They're still very good. You'll probably see Take West Stairs being used a lot, and you'll probably maybe sometimes see Tame the Land used a couple times. But for the most part, the new ones are Stake a Claim, which is you complete this grand strategy if 3 or more friendly Galletian champions are wholly within the enemy territory. That's a cool one. It's kind of like Take What's Theirs, but Galletian, restrictive and not about like what your opponent's units are. You're probably not going to see it played very often, and that's because it's Galletian champions as a whole. They're not mounted. They're much slower than a typical army. They're also typically less wounds, less sticky than the rest of your typical units or more traditional beat stick heroes on mounts and so forth. So unlikely you're going to see a lot of play. It seems risky to take most of the time. Survival's Instinct is the next one, and it is you complete this grand strategy if the model picked to be your general is a Galletian champion, and it is contesting an objective wholly outside of your territory by the end of the game. So that one is also super hard and problematic, mostly because not that like a lot of people's generals are usually have a command trait that enables some kind of force multiplication mechanics, so they're usually typically on some probably most likely on a JC or Galletian Champion unit, or they're going to be positioned on mounted heroes, so they're not as impactful. But the condition in that grand strategy that is very challenging is the an objective wholly outside your territory, and that's actually problematic because some missions do not have objectives outside of your territory unless it's the basically opponent's home objective. So it makes it kind of really challenging to have this guy trek the table, get to that objective, and then survive at the end of the game. The scenarios in which this happens are typically so one-sided, you're going to win without this grand strategy, basically. So it doesn't really necessarily matter. But there is a lot of missions in which there is center objectives, and some of them are not wholly, they're not touching your territory, so they're wholly outside. So I could see it being played. It's definitely having a grand strategy that's basically an linchpin onto one model, who's typically, less than 10 wounds, because that's the only way it's a Galletian champion, seems kind of risky. They did introduce mechanics that kind of offset this, like you could take an enhancement that gives them, or basically an artifact of power in this case, a 5-up ward, so that does, basically, add like almost a third effective wounds to the model, since it's, ignores a third of the wounds. And then you can also take an aspect of the champion, which is another new mechanic they added in this GHB, and this is unique to only Galletian champions, and this is a unique enhancement, meaning you can take one per army unless you decide to use like command entourage or warlord to basically add more unique enhancement to your army. In this case, with this one, you could, the one that makes it slightly resilient is when he dies, you can get him back up D3 wounds on a 3-up. But the problem is it doesn't roll at the end of the phase, it rolls immediately when he dies. So if your opponent has multiple units activating into him, he can still die that same phase. I don't know. It's very unlikely that we'll see a lot of play out of that one as well. There's too many missions where the only objective wholly outside of your territory is in your opponent's home objective side, and that's challenging for JCs to get there. The day is yours. When the battle ends, you complete this grand strategy if there are more friendly Galletian champion from your starting army than Galletian champions from your opponent's army on the battlefield. That one is very interesting because it kind of introduces a mechanic in which, like, if you want to take JCs into your army because you want to score battle tactics, or you want to plan on killing your opponent's JC because you want to stop him from scoring these new battle tactics we have yet to cover, they both, that grand strategy both fits in the same framework. Like you're being rewarded for basically achieving the battle tactics by taking this grand strategy, because you want to stop your opponent from scoring them with their JCs, and you want to score yours with your JCs. So in a sense, it's not asymmetric; it's completely symmetrical to the overall game plan. And people can ask me, well, how come the other two are not asymmetrical? How come the other two are asymmetrical versus symmetrical? Well, they're asymmetrical because they require you a list design choice, in the sense that you have to take a general as a JC. You also have to gamble if the game is not going necessarily well in your favor, because to get to that objective wholly and contesting it, it's pretty challenging in surviving. Like, it doesn't say you have to score the objective; it just says you have to contest, which is great. It makes it slightly more reasonable, but it's still very hard. And then finally, the last one, being like 3 JCs and holding it within the enemy territory. It seems like when your opponent's trying to kill them anyway because they're trying to prevent you from scoring, it's just like it plays more into their strategy and less about your strategy. And this one is just having more than your opponent. So if you're focused on just killing theirs and just keeping yours alive, you're winning. Like, it's you're basically winning the game for playing the game. It's more points for doing the same you're supposed to do. So I think you'll see that one used a lot. Typically, the armies you'll probably see it are like, think of it like a Seraphon army, which is a very shooting army with lots of ability to control the board and shooting, and not just like the traditional shooting phase, through their magic as well, which is cool because one of the mechanics I unfortunately forgot to explain earlier, and I'll get into it right now, is that they introduced a mechanic in which you cannot shoot Galletian Champion units of missile weapons. So that basically means shooting attacks are not magic effectively, if they're within 1 inch of a friendly battle line unit, unless you have another battalion they added, which circumvents the rule, so you can still do that. But the point was that Seraphon don't really need to invest in that battalion because they have magic that lets them, table-wide magic that lets them just basically target like those JCs as they see fit, to just whittling them down with mortal wounds or effectively just straight up kill them. So having like an army that basically takes force multiplier JCs like the Skink Priest and so forth in Seraphon, and then having on top of that the ability to just at very little risk value and play with your opponent, you can remove their JCs without actually needing your JCs to go out there and score battle tactics necessarily for Seraphon. Like, you'll probably end up doing that, but what I'm trying to say is, if you can touch their JC without like putting yours in at any risk, it's a great grand strategy, and an army that does that very well will benefit very well from that is Seraphon. Which I'm sure the internet and the rest of the Age of Sigmar community is probably like, why do we need to buff Seraphon? They need the opposite, guys. Jokingly, they probably got nerfed 18 times. They're still great. So the reckoning day is coming for them eventually. So that's the grand strategies for the new GHB. In terms of battle tactics, the reality is most of them, and this is going to be probably an opinion that's going to be shocking to you all, most of the battle tactics for JCs are irrelevant. And here's why. If you're going to play an army in this edition, you're going to be, and you want to win GTs with, you're going to want to play armies that have solid book tactics, and preferably one that has a solid book's grand strat. But solid book tactics means that like you don't necessarily, if you're going to build a script of like how you're going to score battle tactics for a round on a specific mission, you're going to design it around of, okay, I want to do eye for an eye eventually because my opponent's going to kill something. I just have to kill anything. Not restrictive at all. Doesn't matter. So it's really important to to take battle tactics which are not very restrictive in how to score and are accessible. And some books some battle tomes allow you to get those very easily from your faction, and some don't. The case and example is like, the Daughters of Cain book, which has some of the easiest battle tactics to score with very, very little interaction and restriction, versus some other factions like Stormcast, which are and in some cases Iron Jaws as well, which are one of the more or older book of 3.0, which have more restrictive, basically battle tactics to score. So you're kind of like those books which are more restrictive. They have to depend on the GHB battle tactics to help them score 5 battle tactics a game. The problem with the JC ones they introduce is that fundamentally they're not this. They're not. They don't basically. They're not a separate game plan. You want battle tactics to basically mimic both your like they have to work in cohesion with the winning primary points. So when you're approaching a game of AOS, you have your primary points of scoring objectives, your 2 points from scoring basically a battle tactic, and then at the end of the game you have the grand strategy. Barring there's one mission that does not have any objective and thus is only battle tactics and grand strategy in the game. The issue with or saying actually let me remind myself because I think it's only battle tactics. I don't even think grand strats in the equation for that mission. Please, Games Workshop, stop printing missions which are basically completely like totally don't care about your scoring system you've introduced in whatever rule set. Stop doing that, please. So going back to the reason why these Galletian Champion battle tactics don't matter as much is they all require you to, for the most part, to control the objective at the end of the turn. If you are already basically planning on controlling the objectives, so let me rephrase that correctly. If the game plan is that I need to pick this battle tactic and I need to take this objective and I need these heroes to do it, it's actually kind of like it's in a sense very restrictive because you have to achieve it of all of these things. And while it could work in the overall game plan, it also is very easy for your opponent to say, I'm going to try to not enable you to do this. When I'm talking about like non-interactive easy battle tactics, those are battle tactics in which it is irrelevant what your opponent does outside of his dice rolls, right? Like this is in a situation like these are effectively you have to put yourself into situations where your opponent basically can stop you from doing that. Now, what I mean by that, and let me explain in that sense. If my opponent is sitting on an objective, and I decide that to get this battle tactic this turn, the only way that's going to happen is if I get my JCs on that objective and take control of it. My opponent knows that all he has to do is either maybe kill the JC, because in most cases the JC might be forced to engage the unit to even get on the objective due to positioning of models, or I just have to make sure that I can survive or redeploy more models than is available for my opponent to score objective. It is actually kind of a gamble to score these as a whole. When is it not a gamble to score these? It's at the beginning of the game. And this is kind of like harkens back to what I was trying to say, why they don't really matter. It's because the easiest way to score these battle tactics, like those kind of battle tactics I was referring to that are basically non-linear, they are non-interactive with your opponent, is if you're basically top of turn 1 and you just walk onto the objectives. And then you can score it very well. And I should probably let me do a read through of like what these battle tactics for Galletian Champions are. We have a Matter of Honor, which is a Galletian Champion or Sworn Bodyguard, which is from that unit that's knocked by that battalion. When you're on the battlefield, you complete this battle tactic. The unit is destroyed during this turn by an attack made by a friendly Galletian Champion or Sworn Bodyguard unit. So basically, if you kill a Galletian unit or Sworn Bodyguard with a Galletian Champion or a Sworn Bodyguard unit, you score that one. This is where it gets weird because it's like, well, now like I never want to take the Sworn Bodyguard battalion. Like that just completely renders that battle tactic gone. But at the same time, the counter argument would be, well, it's also Galletian Champion, so it doesn't really matter. Most people are going to have Galletian Champions. So it's cool. It's an easy kind of kill one, but it's still, I don't know. It feels risky to use it most of the time. If you can find like every time you have the ability to get away from picking kill specific unit battle tactics, you should try to not take those in as much as possible because you're throwing too many dice elements into succeeding into that battle tactic. Unless the odds are so stacked in your favor, like the guy's down on 1 moon or the units down to one model, like something like that. Like you should probably never gamble on those battle tactics, because battle tactics which restrict you to killing a specific thing open up too many counterplays for your opponent for you to succeed. And also killing things requires a lot of dice rolls, which you want to score battle tactics with 0 dice if possible involved. Lead the assault. You complete this battle tactic of at least 2 of the objectives you control on an enemy territory, and each are contested by any friendly Galletian champion. Cool. Like, there's a lot of missions that have at least 2 objectives outside of your whole outside, what's it called? That are reachable by your foot walking heroes, and we'll talk about a little in a bit later. I have about like what the distance, the average distances, and so forth that you have to walk to score that one. But for the most part, like, what if your opponent gets first and sits on the objective? It seems risky to pick that because first it requires you to do it on 2 objectives, and it has to be with at least 2 different Galletian champions in that situation. Like, once again, it's like it requires you to involve dice if you are basically if your opponent's sitting on the objective. The only time you would pick it is if you just either no one's on the objective, so you can just walk onto it, or if the odds are so stacked in your favor that like you feel confident you can achieve this one. United Offense. Pick one objective controlled by your opponent. You complete this battle tactic if you control that objective and 2 or more friendly Galletian champions are contesting an objective at the end of the turn. That one is a similar situation as the previous one. I prefer that one over the last one, mostly because you can kind of stack the odds in your favor when it's limited to 1 objective. You don't necessarily have to engage on multiple basically fronts, so you can overload to try to get it. It's easier to score. But once again, it is requiring you to do things that are basically a bit challenging. Like, there is ways to score this battle tactics without killing any of your opponent's units. It's just if your opponent is basically allowing you enough room to get as more models than he has on the objective, and you can basically squeeze your Galletian champions. That is a situation. But not a lot of armies can do that, fairly easily in the game. And secondly, like, most of your opponents are not going to try to not let you do that. They're just like, it seems like, once again, if you're basically, due to the fact that these missions require you to take control of objectives, or these battle tactics require you control of these objectives, it seems that they're going to be, as people are going to play out this GHB, they're going to quickly realize, like, I'm not really, like, why would I pick this? It seems risky. Especially, like, yeah, in this situation, like, you're probably, like, want to pick it later in the game. This one can be scored later in the game, especially in a situation where you're kind of clearly winning, versus the other one, lead the assault. Like, if you're clearly winning the game, it's unlikely you can score 2 more objectives that are in your enemy territory. It's just, yeah, it's, long story short, it seems they seem easy to do, but you want battle tactics. Most players will tell you want battle tactics which aren't just easy to do, where there's just, you don't have to engage your opponent like interactively to score them. Cunning maneuver. Pick one friendly Galletian champion on the battlefield that is more than 3 inches from all enemy units. You complete this battle tactic at the end of the turn if that Galletian champion is more than 3 inches from all enemy units and contesting an objective you control that is wholly outside your territory. That one's probably, I would say, the version we used to call in the previous GHB ATO against the odd. This is a new against the odd, but it still has like some massive weird restrictions. Like the hero can't be within any range of combat when you score it. So odds are most likely in the first half of the game, like that's what's gonna happen. Secondly, like he can't be in combat when he's contesting the objective. Why? Okay, sure. So once again, like this is another situation. Like if your opponent basically completely is in a board state has the ability to block you from scoring that one just by blocking the ability for your hero to contest that objective without engaging you. And then secondly and finally, there's another restriction. It has to be wholly outside your territory. Now, I believe the reason why they wrote this battle tactic like this is they didn't want units like heroes that are reserve specific or can come through reserves can't easily score that. They can't score that one because they're not on the board at the start of the turn. So they wanted them to be a little bit like more challenging. Now they did introduce a unique enhancement where called Tunnel Master, where you could technically achieve this battle tactic with very little effort if you have that unique enhancement. But from a whole, like if you ignore these like unique enhancement bonuses, it's like it is easy to do if it's early in the game. As the game goes on, it gets drastically harder to achieve. And that's kind of like the moral of like all of these Galletian Champion battle tactics. It's like you can easily score them if you're top of the turn and in the beginning of the game. But as soon as like the turn, basically the game progresses, they get drastically harder and harder. You'll start losing Galletian Champions. Your opponent will start basically getting a better foothold on top of objectives. Like all of those things become a little bit much harder to basically score with them. So now, that's when I started the beginning of the conversation with might shock you that like these battle tactics are actually harder than what it seems is it's because of that. You're going to want to basically more likely than not score them in the beginning of the game. And if you do score them at the end of the game, you're already probably winning the game. So like it's most, in terms of if you're in a GT scenario where point differentials doesn't matter, then like having them scoring them in the end of the game over another battle tactic at like zero cost to you winning the game has no impact. So because let's look about the other battle tactics, which are the generic one in this GHB, gaining momentum, pick an enemy unit in a battlefield, and if you destroy it and control more objectives than your opponent in a turn, you get that one. That one's, you would argue is pretty restrictive too, since it depends on you killing an enemy unit. So you're not going to see and use in the beginning of the game. You're going to wait until the second half of the game. But it doesn't require keywords. It doesn't require certain positioning. It just requires that you control more objectives, not specific objectives, and you can easily wait until the later half of the game to score it. Versus the other ones get a little bit harder in the second half of the game to score. An eye for an eye. You complete this battle tactic if one or more friendly units was destroyed in the previous turn, and one or more enemy units was destroyed this turn. Now, that one's a bit of a weird one because there's like most people forget like it's specifically to the previous turn, not the previous game turn. So just be cognizant of that. For the audience that doesn't know what that means, it means that like in AOS, since there's basically the initiative roll, and you basically you went bottom of the turn and then top of it the next turn, and your opponent didn't kill any enemy units in the bottom of the last turn, you can't do eye for an eye. Even though they might have destroyed one of your units in the top of the turn last turn, right? Because it's even though it feels like it's just like the last turn, even if you're the top of the following turn, it's that anyway. Be mindful of that when you pick that one. Desecrate their lands, easy one. Pick a terrain feature or faction terrain feature that is partially or wholly even enemy territory. You complete this battle, you control that terrain feature at the end of the turn. Basically, that means have more models than your opponent within 3 inches of that terrain feature. So this is where like small reserve flanking units, score it easily. Sometimes a lot of terrains touch your enemy territory, but are in no man's land. So even like if you're pushing the center objective, you probably score it very easily. Like that one's easy. It's great. It's hard to counter, and it's hard for your opponent, and it's just very easy with very little restriction. This is one of the hardest one in the book. Pick an enemy unit on the battlefield. You can make this battle tactic if the unit is destroyed during this turn by an attack made by the model picked to be your channel. That one's challenging because it's not a lot of, like, once again, it requires a general big killie, and it's also very dicey. You have to really kind of cherry pick a unit that's already whittled down before you do it. Like that one's, I would say on the bottom tier of like battle tactics. But it's like, as I talked about, like maybe you want to follow a script. So you got gaining momentum, eye for an eye, desecrate their land. So gaining momentum, you're going to want to do probably turn 2 and 3. So let's just say you do it on turn 3. Eye for an eye is usually an easy one to score on turn 2 because that's when most armies start engaging in the game and things start getting killed. So, eye for an eye is a great turn 2. Now that leaves you desecrate their land. Desecrate their land is a great one in turn, in the later half of the game when things are getting whittled down, or even a turn 3 objective, a turn 3 priority if you have reserves coming down. So, now you're basically the tables have been set. You pushed around models, and then you maybe had a flank that pushed through your opponent's line, and now they're like, cool, like they're too far to reach anything else, but they can reach this terrain feature. So desecrate the land. So, Eye for Night turn 2, gaining momentum turn 3, desecrate the land turn 4. So that leaves you 2 battle tactics you actually have to resolve, which is your turn 5 and your turn 1 battle tactic. Now, turn 5 battle tactic, it's really hard to believe that any of the Galletian Champion ones are still an option by turn 5. Because either your Galletian Champions are dead, and if you're already winning the game massively and you have maybe 1 Galletian Champion left alive, you can achieve Cunning Maneuver. But more likely than not, if you went first at the top of the game, you probably did that one first. So it's probably not available for your turn 5. If you went bottom of the first turn, you probably picked one of your book battle tactics to score. Because it's very hard to achieve any of the JC ones but basically removing your opponent's units off objectives. So which means you probably picked one of your book tactic ones. So what's the moral of the story? Play a faction that has 2 great book tactics. You can score either turn 1 or turn 5, and then you basically follow that script for Eye for Night turn 2, gaining momentum turn 3, desecrate their land turn 4. And that comes up to a wrap of you don't really need Galletian Champion battle tactics to win game. And maybe people walk away from this conversation thinking, oh, is the answer to the question that you need 0 Galletian Champion? Well, it depends. That, as a traditional econ answer would say, it depends. There's some books that don't have battle tactics, which are very which allow them to ignore the Galletian Champion mechanic to score. So you should probably look at what Galletian Champions should you consider in an army. The go-to number, in my opinion, is 2 and here's the reason why. Since they're only really there to be scored in the beginning of the game, you really only want them around, realistically speaking, you only want to use the battle tactics on turn 1 and maybe turn 2 if you have an option for it. And then the later half of the game, you're probably better off using the other GHB ones, or one of your rare book ones that you can, Battletome one you can actually use. So over investing in JC means that unless they're basically working the overall game plan of your army, there seems to be a real opportunity cost associated to them. And I want to go through what I mean by that. Give me a second as I prep up the material here that I wanted to go over. So we discussed this earlier, but and we're transitioning now. Fantastic. We discussed this earlier, and I wanted to show you an example of what I mean by the opportunity cost JCs. So this is a stupid radar graph. People hate radar graph. People love radar graph. But it's, at the end of the day, I'm just trying to capture 4 attributes about JCs: bulliness, stickiness, maneuverability, and how harmonious they are in your army. What you'll notice as I'm going through presenting this is that when you pick a JC for one of those attributes, you're sacrificing on another attribute that is, obviously costly. Now, what I mean by bulliness is the ability that JC to be basically bullying units on objectives or other JCs on the objective. Really, overall, you can think about killing power, or the amount of bodies it counts on the objective is a type of bulliness, right? Ogre JCs are very good because there are 5 models on objective, so they can kind of bully their way above the opponent's JC without really caring about killing it, or they, so forth and so forth, right? That's bulliness. Stickiness is the effective wound count of, or if you want to think about durability of the hero, being considered healing and ward saves and or ethereal for Nighthaunt, and so forth. And maneuverability is basically how fast is your JC at getting those early objectives or not in no man's land, effectively. That's how I'm defining maneuverability. And what I mean, let me expand on that real quick. When we look back at my mission topography, video I did last week, what I added onto this is I wanted to explain, in this GHB, the average distance between the center objectives, no man's objective, from that are within your territory, meaning there are, when you see missions, sometimes your territory touches an objective in the no man's land. The average distance away is only 3 inches that you need to travel to contest it. right? Because you're typically 9 inches away from that opponent's territory, meaning, and since the objective is right smack the center of that radius, you only need to travel 3 inches, so not very far. But what about the objectives in which are not inside, basically touching each other's territory? They're an average of, you need to at least move 7 inches to get there. So for me, maneuverability is, I'm measuring it based on, like, if your hero needs to run to get to that center to contest that objective, which are in no man's land, not in your territory, that's not very maneuverable. If you're able to just walk on there, that's decent. But if you're at the ability to get to the center of that objective, you're highly maneuverable. And the reason why is because if your opponent is trying to block you from scoring it, you're basically, instead of having almost a 10-inch charge or 12-inch charge, if you just got to the edge and your opponent is sitting on the other edge, like, it's unreasonable you're going to get to charge them and push them off. But if you can travel to at least the center of the objective, you can have a fairly easy charge to reach them, to try to bully your way, to gain that objective. So maneuverability, that's the way I'm measuring it. And harmoniousness, or what harmonious of the JC, meaning, hey, how much of this overall game plan does that JC, improve your army? Like, how much of a force multiplier? Like, we're thinking Skink Priest here, or we're thinking Battlesmith for Fire Slayers. Anything that basically says, like, how much force, synergy does this, unit bring to my army overall, outside of just being a JC itself? So I started comparing some data. I didn't through all the factions. There's just too many of them. But I wanted to give you a concept of, like, when you make a decision about JC, usage in your army, if the ideal slot is 2 JCs, so which JCs should you prioritize in each army? And my go-to answer is, really depends, like, what you're trying to do. Do you want those JCs to be able to be bullies, like, let's say, like a Grimwrath, which has, like, maximal bulliness with good stickiness, but, like, it's not very maneuverable since it's only 4-inch movement, and then has 0 synergy with your army, right? Like 1 being the lowest denominator here. Or do you want to take, like, maybe a Flamekeeper, which has 0 bulliness, 0 okay stickiness, 0 maneuverability, but then, like, max harmoniousness. Like, his mechanic, while I don't personally like it, but it is a huge force multiplier when it is triggered. Same with, like, when we look at the Battlesmith, like, he's a bit more bully, and it's just as sticky, but has a little bit less, basically force multiplying effects. You can think of, like, your JC on that matrix, effectively, how you want to pick those. I prefer to pick JCs if you're going to be, like, a more static army, like Seraphon or Lumineth, or if you're going to invest in your JCs, you probably want them to be more harmonious and either, like, maneuverable or sticky. But if you're looking for more, like, an army like Slaves of Darkness, you're probably going to want a JC that is effectively more bully and highly maneuver and sticky over harmonious. Because when you're looking at them, like, the Chaos Sword is very good at that, but then when your options are very limited, actually, surprisingly, in Slaves of Darkness, which is a very high War Scroll book, because, you're looking at, like, let's say the Chaos Sorcerer Lord, like, Chaos Sorcerer Lord it's not very sticky. He's okay maneuverability, and in terms of harmony, like, it's the spell casting, and then the 6-up ward from Auricular Vision, it seems mediocre for, he's not really force multiplying your army. And this is, like, one of the, like, kind of repeating things you see in most of the, when I started doing this analysis, is that a lot of JCs don't really force multiply your army that well unless you're very specific factions. Like, one of them is, like, the Nighthaunt. I think Nighthaunt is, like, the in terms of JC quality, has the highest JC quality available. Their Crusader, their Krollghast Crusader is a huge force multiplier, since he literally reduces all damages they take by 1. He's very sticky. He has a 4-up, ignore all rend save. He has 6 wounds. He has a 6-up ward save. He's highly mobile. He flies with an 8-inch movement. He doesn't have a lot of bulliness to him, but he is very, like, he fits, like, kind of like the ideal JC for, in my regards, for, like, types of armies. And then, like, same with the Guardian of Soul, like, less bully, but still very, like, huge force multiplier. The Knight of Shroud is the one, who's less of a force multiplier. He does have force multiplying mechanics because of his, like, command ability, like, redundancy he brings, but he also is like, slightly bullyish. So if you wanted to look into a JC for a Nighthawk that was able to be like the target if you are going to invest into the Galletian Command battalion, like he'd be a great pick, for example, for that. Same with the Lord Executioner. I think they're both fantastic pick for that battalion combination. But in terms of just like if you're just looking for 2 JCs to do the bare minimum to score those battle tactics early in the game, you have to look nowhere else than just like taking the harmonious ones, the ones that basically build force multiplying effects for your army. One of the armies I was very happy with in terms of like JCs was also Flesh Eater Court. They just have like most of them are very maneuverable, like, and they have clear trade-offs. Like the Arc Regent is like very harmonious. He brings like mechanically his spell plus his ability to bring in reserves, like additional units. His speed is not that bad. He's pretty sticky with his healing mechanic and the number of wounds he has, like, and a ward save on top of that. That book is cool because you can clearly like, okay, like Arc Regent makes sense. Like he's a great support character, decent JC. And then you can look at the Vargolf, which is kind of like same thing, like kind of bully, not as sticky, but faster and has great harmony because of its respawning mechanics in your units. Like Flesh Eater Courts have probably, in terms of like these metrics, have some of the best JCs as well. So like Nighthawk and Flesh Eater Courts are good at in that spectrum. Does that mean like this format and this edition makes those armies like drastically better than they used to be? Probably not, but I think they did become like overall better because they have access. They have heroes that can access those battle tactics a lot, easier than some of the other factions, effectively. But it still comes down to the fact that like they're only, in my opinion, scoreable easily from the first half of the game, first 2 turns, effectively. And as soon as the game enters its basically end state, like they get almost near impossible or like to score or very hard to score. And if they're easy to score at that point, you're pretty much already winning the game, so it doesn't really matter. But yeah, that is basically kind of like what I wanted to cover today about Galletian Champion. I feel like I probably talked way longer than I needed to and rambled on about the various topics related to this thing. But there is one last topic we need to cover, which is kind of the opposite subject, is what about a no Galletian Champion strategy? Can you play Can you play this GHB with no Galletian Champion? And the answer is fuck yeah, you can. Because like we'll take an example for a faction that doesn't have Galletian Champions. Sons of Behemoth. Now they did like a bit of like I wouldn't say a nerf, but they got adjusted in terms of hitting power from their last battle tome to the current battle tome. But some major value from this GHB to this new one is that Proving Grounds is no longer a thing, which was a huge basically penalty to Giants player in terms of being able to score the primary points in the table. By having that being removed from the game, the Giants table, like on certain missions, are basically almost auto wins, like Realmstone Cache. Like if the Giants player decides to put like 3 of his megas on the center objective, because he's a 1-drop army, so he gets top of turn. I don't think many armies, no matter how deadly and lethal you are, can basically go chew through that entire like those units for 2 turns. And all of a sudden, like that Giants player, not only has a potentially what's it called, a 4-point different advantage, because score 1, score more, score 1, score more, and your opponent didn't score any and couldn't score more for this primary. He also has the possibility, is like if you're building for the JC battle tactics to score in the first half of the game, you still need to control that objective. So in Realmstone Cache, like what battle you need to be able to score either desecrate their land on turn 1 through like reserve mechanics, or you need to have a book tactic that lets you. But like in some factions that do not have that as an option, like let's think OBR, for example. If OBR doesn't have a good battle tactic to score because they didn't take Death Riders, and they were depending on their JC one to do it, they're kind of screwed. Like they're just like, now you're looking at a 6-point swing, and 6-point swing might as well be like the game over at that point. Like it's such a hard disparity to catch back on. So yes, there is a world in which no Galletian Champion is a winning strategy in the game, because fundamentally all of the Galletian mechanics are all about scoring the primary mission. Like, if you're scoring the primary mission, you can score them. They're just more restrictive and they require certain like conditions to that. But you can say, screw it, I don't want to deal with those conditions, but I want to make it as hard as possible for my opponent to score those. Like, think about like Stormkeep, for example. Stormkeep, Stormcast, a lot of those missions where the center objectives are literally touching each other's territory, those Stormkeep model, like the Stormkeep Redeemer units that can just, I don't know, touch the objective, sit on it as far away as possible from you, they're all 3 models each on that objective. It's really hard to just basically, because Expert Conqueror has gone away, it's really hard for opponents to basically put that pressure into these objectives on top of turn 1. And then like limiting that access for your opponent to score those JC battle tactics is hugely problematic. Once again, it's like it completely comes down to the fact that like, since those JC battle tactics play too much in the game, the game of controlling those objectives, which is the primary, they're easy for your opponents to basically interrupt or disrupt. And now you're basically back to, well, I need to be able to score my book battle tactics over the Galletian ones. So it really comes down to like, I only see them as effectively good in the top of turn 1, and that's it. So yeah, no JC strategy, totally a working strategy. And you should really consider it. I mean, I'm planning on to, even though I posted an article or a video 2 weeks ago about Fire Slayers and it has a ton of JCs. The JC mechanic in that list is completely irrelevant to this formula. Like for me, they don't need the JC battle tactics. They have plenty of great battle tactics. They have a great grand strategy. The whole thing was just like, it was a nice little bonus, but it does nothing to enhance my winning strategy of that army. In regards to like armies where like want to invest in those JCs, like I think you're gonna find yourself in situations where it's more penalizing than it is helpful in the sense of the world. As people figure out how to play this edition, they're gonna have problems. You're gonna find your opponents are gonna find ways to like make it really hard for you to achieve those battle tactics if you pick them early in the game, and like unless you're top of turn 1. I feel like I'm probably repeating myself too many times. Next episode, I'm thinking about doing it on what is the difference between centralized and decentralized threats and how valuable they are in the game when you're planning an army. I want to do a series on army list creation and design, and how do you approach like the overall winning strategy of AOS while building proactively in your army list. So that's going to be, instead of doing a whole episode on that topic, I'm rather deconstruct it and have like talk about the abstract reasons of like, why should you plan a list around decentralized threat? Why should you plan a list around centralized threats? And so I look forward to getting your feedback on this video and then your feedback on the next video. And I hope you like this content. I hope it's not too boring as you listen to me rambling, but if you're still here, then I'll take that as a, yes. All right, guys. Thanks a lot for watching, and see you next time.